Well, thank you, and I'm glad to be here again. As he said, we're going to talk about working around forklifts. And I know some of you probably have your, you have a fork truck license and you actually are an authorized operator. But even if that's the case, most of us spend a lot more time working around a forklift than we do operating a forklift. And so I think that it's important to understand, and go through some of the dangers. And quite frankly, a lot of accidents that happen in this country that are forklift-related accidents, they're really pedestrian accidents that a forklift was involved. Because, let's face it, we can all be kind of stupid about how we interact around these pieces of equipment. And I think for, some of us, we may not understand and appreciate the complex job that a forklift operator has when they're out there and how difficult it really is to work around those pedestrians. And so I think, anytime that you may go out on a job site and there's heavy equipment, or you go out on the shop floor and you're working around the forklifts, I think it's important to have a healthy respect for the job that people are doing out there and take care of yourselves. As you can tell, we put another, what are we calling them? Training aid in front of you. You don't have to put your name on it, but if you would, please answer the questions as we go through the program. And I would like to point out that Roger's taking these tests, and he's calculating the answers and seeing if there were any questions that a large majority of people missed, so that we can cover them in the next class. And there was one question that some people had problems with, and so I'd like to talk about that. If you remember last month we talked about lockout tagout. And one of the questions it basically was asking you to define a lockout device. And it had a blank there, and the answer was a positive means. But basically there's lockout procedures, but a lockout device is actually something that you positively lock out, physically lock out the energy source. So that was a question a lot of people missed, and they had actually, those that missed it had intelligent answers put in there. It's just that it was more of a vernacular thing of what was on the slide. So it was a positive means was the answer. But we'll motor on to this. I want to talk a little bit about the differences between a car and a forklift, because if you're working around a forklift, sometimes you may not really fully appreciate that. I mean, it's four wheels and it's like a little car to those of us that don't operate a forklift, right? Well, not really, because there's a lot of differences that make them less safe to be around than a car. And just talk about how we can work safely around forklifts. As I just said, forklifts and people are a dangerous mix. Most accidents that happen on forklifts, it's not the forklift operator that gets hurt. It's one of us that are working around them, so we need to be careful. There are approximately 100 fatalities every year with forklift-related accidents, so that's a lot of people dying around something that we should be able to make ourselves safe from. And there are about 20,000 serious injuries every year from forklifts. So, we've had our share of near misses and some accidents through the years, that are related to forklifts. So, it's something we need to pay attention to. Some of the types of accidents that are happening out there with forklifts: crush between a vehicle and a surface. That's crushed between a forklift and the surface. So that's a pedestrian that is walking along, and the forklift, rams into them and crushes them between a rock and a hard place. 25% of the accidents were that cause of loss. Crushed between two vehicles. So that's a pedestrian that's hit by two forklifts. That's not your day if that happens to you. You've done something wrong. And 11% of those accidents struck or run over by a vehicle. That's 10% of the accidents. And struck by falling material. You know, that's probably the most senseless one. That's the one that we as a pedestrian probably have the most control over, is stay away from the forklift when they're, you know, hoisting materials. So, but that just kind of gives you a rough breakdown of how our pedestrians getting hurt out there working around forklifts. One thing that's different from a car and a forklift, and what makes a forklift unique and more dangerous, is just simply the weight. And I don't think a lot of people understand that a loaded fork truck, even though it takes up much less space than a vehicle, a loaded fork truck can weigh as much as 5 times a vehicle, a car, a truck, you know, a light truck. So there's a lot of weight, a lot of mass, which equates to a lot of energy when you get crushed between it and something else. So we just have to really stop and understand that the weight of that is one of those characteristics that makes it unique. Also, a slow forklift has the same impact as a car going 30 miles an hour.
Scott, is number one a trick question?
Yeah, because there's no answer.
You passed. Wow.
So we need to write in 30?
No, I just need to change my slide.
What is the right answer?
Hey, cross out 25 and write 30, and I know. Wow. Didn't I just say in here that how difficult it is to make a test out? I said I have a newfound respect for every professor that ever had to write like a 100-question test, because it's a tough job. Sorry. I got to do a better job. Steve, would you be my, I'm going to start sending those to you and make sure that they're right. But 30 miles an hour, even a slow-moving forklift will have the same force, and that's because of the weight, the mass, the energy, as a car going 30 miles an hour. So when that forklift is out there tooling along at its 5 miles an hour, and you decide to step out in front of it, think about if I was standing out here on the road and there was a car going down the road 30 miles an hour, would I step out in front of it? No, because you understand that hazard. And you recognize that as a hazard. But you guys will jump out in front of a 5 mile an hour forklift all day long and think nothing of it. So that's why we're trying to equate the two. Another thing that makes a forklift unique from a vehicle and being around vehicles is the steering. You know, for some of you, you may not realize that a forklift steers from the rear wheels, which makes it act a little bit differently to be around. One thing is the rear end is going to swing way out as it turns. Okay? Has anybody ever been walking beside a forklift and they turn and you were kind of caught off guard about how close it got to you? Because you weren't expecting it to swing out like that. A car, when you turn with the front wheels, it tracks, and so it's going to go away from you. But with the forklift, when it turns, that back end's actually going to move towards you if you're standing the opposite the direction they're turning. So you have to understand that so that we don't get caught in that rear end swing. If anybody's walking close enough to a forklift that you would get caught in that rear end swing, you've already put yourself at danger, even if the forklift's not planning on turning. Okay? So you should be further away from it than that to begin with. Another difference between vehicles and forklifts is there's rules out here. There's stop signs, there's traffic signals, there's speed limits, there's directional signs. There's a lot of rules out there, and most of us understand those rules of the road. And we understand that a high percentage of cars are going to stop at that big red octagon. But we go out on the shop floor, there is no lanes. There are no stop signs. There are no speed limit signs. There are no directions of travel. So literally a forklift could be coming from any direction at multiple different speeds, and so there's no really good lane of traffic. So there's not necessarily a good place to stand. There's not, when you're working around forklifts, you have to be constantly aware because they could be coming from any direction. So that's a major way that it's different than being around cars. You know, it's significantly more dangerous than like walking in the Walmart parking lot where, you know, most cars are going to be in a lane of traffic. You know, that's a bad example because all the cars that cross through, but that's probably a good comparison of when cars start cutting across and they don't stay in the lanes. That's what it's like being around forklifts out on the shop floor. None of you would, I know, you guys stay in the lanes and you don't cross over, you know, I know, right?
Absolutely.
Car manufacturers spend a lot of time and money and engineering vehicles so that they don't have blind spots, which is ironic because I think the newer cars all have more blind spots than older cars as the windows start shrinking down. But anyway, they try to eliminate blind spots as best they can. And then where there are significant blind spots, we know on a car there's going to be a mirror to compensate for that. But forklifts are loaded with blind spots. And then if driving an empty fork truck wasn't good enough, then we put a great big box on it. And now we got to try to see around it. So once again, another difference between working around cars and working around a forklift is that person operating that forklift may not be able to see you very well. You're hoping the person driving the car is looking through the glass and is going to see you. But driving a forklift, they may be looking through a box. And if they're not looking through a box, they're looking through a mast. And so, how many of you ever have driven a forklift before? When you first, a lot of you have, when you first got on the forklift, were you surprised at how hard it was to see where you were going? I mean, there's a lot in front of you. And so, as a pedestrian, I need to understand that so that we understand that they can't see me that well. So I need to really pay even more caution than I would around that car. Forklift operator has to do a lot of twisting and turning to, you know, they're watching that rear end swing and they're watching, you know, where they're going to place that load and stuff. And they're kind of expecting the pedestrian to be kind of watching out for themselves. Now they should be watching out for you, but they're expecting that you're watching out for them also. Restricted hearing, you know, somebody's driving down the road 5 miles an hour in a car with the window down, we can yell at them, they'd hear us. But a forklift's a little noisier, and you can't hear. So that just is an added hazard, that they're not necessarily going to hear you. They're not necessarily going to hear other warning signs, whether that be yelling or honks or whatever, the horns. So the restricted hearing that a forklift provides is another thing that makes them dangerous to work around. Just to give some of you an idea, in every 3 years, OSHA requires forklift operators to be recertified on a fork truck. And so any of you that have a license, you have gone through that process. And if you haven't gone through that process, then plain and simple, you're not authorized to operate a forklift at George Cook Sons, okay? And I always throw this out. It doesn't mean that you're not qualified if you've operated a forklift for 30 years at a previous job. If you come here, you're not an authorized forklift operator if you haven't gone through George Cook Sons forklift operator training class, okay? Plain and simple. Don't care how much you know about a forklift. You may be the best forklift operator in this building. If you haven't gone through that training, you're not authorized to operate a forklift. But this is some of the requirements that people go through to get the training. The classroom training, and there's a written test involved. So they sit in the classroom, they talk about things like stability triangles and momentum and things that, you know, put them at risk while they're operating the forklift and cause forklift tip overs and things. And then there's a hands-on driving test, and that's where they hop on and they do a simulated job thing where they get evaluated. There's a checklist, and if they pass, then they get their license, and if they don't pass, they can be retested. And if they never pass, then they're not authorized ever to operate the forklift. So there's the classroom and the hands-on portion. And then again, every 3 years, it's OSHA policy and George Cook policy that those people go through a recertification process of somebody evaluating to make sure that they still understand. There's some other times when OSHA says that they need to be retrained. If there's an accident that would indicate that training was lacking and that was one cause of loss, so they would ask for you to retrain and recertify then. Also, if someone is observed operating a forklift unsafely, then that can be an indicator that their training needs to be recertified anyway. So there's a couple things, but otherwise, and basically every 3 years. Here are some warning signs that as pedestrians that we need to look at. A lot of forklifts have strobe lights, horns that they should be using them. In forklift training, at least that I do, and I know most people that do forklift training, we really stress the idea that the horn isn't for, saying hi to somebody, and the horn isn't for saying, meaner things when you're just like a car. That horn is supposed to be a useful safety device. It's not supposed to be a communication device when you're unhappy with the person around you or in front of you, okay? And so we teach that if you hear a tap on a horn, that means that I need to be on high alert that there's a forklift around that I don't want to get hit by. Backup alarms, all forklifts should have a backup alarm. And what I would challenge you all to do, and that the more time you spend out around forklifts, the more prone you are to tune those things out. And you hear a backup alarm, like, I'm not around forklifts every day. So when I hear a backup alarm, I'm kind of, looking around to see where I need to go and where I need to be in the safest place that I can be. But I find myself when I'm around people that are around them a lot, they hear a backup alarm and I have to tap them and say, hey, they're wanting to, you need to get out of the way. We tune it out. And so it's a constant challenge for us as pedestrians working around forklifts to make sure that we don't tune that out. Remember, that's like getting hit by a 30-mile-an-hour car. So we want to make sure that we're not tuning those out. And then flashing lights are all some of the warning signs that we need to always be paying attention to. Sounds of the engine, I skipped that one, but just hearing a forklift, don't get so complacent with it that you don't even pay attention. If you hear a forklift, turn and see and make sure you're not in its way. They may have that big load in front of them and they don't see you, okay? And it only costs you a second of time to turn around and see if you're in a safe location. Raised loads, we talked about, 8% of the people that had serious injuries or fatalities were from getting hit with loads. And that's people working around raised loads. Has anybody ever been to Lowe's or Menards or any of those places and they put chains across the aisles whenever they're going to go pick things off the top loads? That's why. And they won't only do the aisle that the forklift is in, but they'll do the one behind it in case it pushes something over the other edge. So that's something that if someone's operating a forklift, and especially as they raise that load, let's steer clear of that. We don't really have a practice of going and cordoning off or chaining off an area when people are raising loads. So let's make sure that we police that ourselves and we don't get around that area. If whatever falls off, it could be as simple as a small box falls off. It could hurt you severely if it's falling from 30 feet. So it doesn't have to be an anvil, I'll use a cartoon reference, falling off of there to really cause problems. It could be something much smaller than that. And this is kind of, this program's for everybody. In fact, we're going to do it in the shop later. And whenever we're putting things together on like a pallet, we want to make sure that we're storing them with some weight distribution in mind and some stability in mind. And when we secure those things on the pallet, we want to make sure that when that operator goes in and lifts that pallet, that as soon as they hit a bump, that everything's not falling off. We want to have secure loads. And the other thing that I say is that if we're responsible for making that load secure on that pallet, then we're actually, if we don't do that job well, then we're putting the forklift operator at risk and everybody around them, because as they're watching those things teeter on that pallet, they're not paying attention to the people working around them, us. They're paying attention to that thing. You know, they're focused on, oh, that's gonna fall, oh, that's gonna fall. And they don't even see people walking in front of them, and the kids running out, and the ball going across the aisle, and the dogs running, right? They get distracted. Stand away when the load is raised, and never walk under a raised load. Pretty simple rules to live by. We talked about the weight of a forklift. We talked about the mass and the energy. One of those energies is momentum. Forklifts are designed to stop really quickly. But any of you that remember your high school physics class, just because that forklift stops quickly doesn't mean that whatever's on the forklift stops quickly. So that's another opportunity for that load to shift. And so even though the forklift may stop and not hit you, the things in it, or the load may come forward and hit you. So you have to, you know, that's even another great reason to not be walking out in front of these things, because they may have time to stop, but then the load comes on you, and that's an equal problem. So want to make sure that we're really paying attention and we're not jumping out in front of these forklifts. Anytime that you're working around a forklift, you want to avoid distractions. You know, it's just like, you know, you may be walking down a safe sidewalk and having a conversation with somebody, but then you get out into a busy intersection. It'd be a pretty good time to maybe stop and stop talking and stop being on the cell phone and stop being distracted long enough to get through that busy intersection so that you can pay attention and you've got your full attention on the hazards around you. It's the same way with a fork truck. You know, anytime that the fork truck's near, it might be time to really pay attention to that fork truck and not pay attention to, or not be distracted by unnecessary things. Always look both ways. And, you know, these are some rules that may seem silly to you all, but, you know, when you do see a forklift, and I see people, I don't care if it's the mall or a factory floor, you see people that always want to walk shoulder to shoulder. And nobody ever wants to give on that. Well, guess what? When you're getting ready to approach a forklift, somebody better give, because somebody's going to get hurt really badly. So walk in single file so that you give that forklift operator A, a very clear aisle to go on, and B, plenty of room so that they know that they can get by you safely. Look out for drops of oil. That's one hazard of forklifts, is that sometimes they drip oil, and that creates hazards on the floor. And if you remember a couple of trainings ago when we talked about accident prevention, it's an unsafe condition with the oil on the floor, but it's an unsafe act if we see the oil and we ignore it and don't clean it up, even if we didn't make the mess, right? So oil on the floor is a hazard that causes people to get hurt. Approaching a forklift driver, we definitely want to stay away until the driver sees us, okay? Don't assume that they see you. I see people all the time, maybe a supervisor walking up to somebody on a forklift, and man, they get inches from that forklift before they really have that driver's attention. And that they may think that the driver sees them approach, but there's no guarantee of that until there's some clear communication between the two of you that they see you, they've stopped completely, and then now you approach. And also, I see people that stand right up next to the fork truck, and a lot of times that's because they leave the fork truck running, that it's a little bit noisier, there may be factory noise all around them, and they stand up and they've got their feet right underneath the wheels. All it has to do is creep forward just a little bit, and you've got, 15,000 pounds of hard rubber wheel crushing your foot. So don't ever put your feet under the fork truck. And then make sure that you walk away before it starts to go, the forklift starts to move again. Right of way. Who has the right of way? A pedestrian or a forklift?
Pedestrian.
Pedestrian always has the right of way, correct? So I'm going to ask you, does anybody in this room think that it's a wise idea to exercise that right? It's absolutely not. It's definitively, in most people's policies, the pedestrian has the right of way, and they do that to put the onus on the forklift operators to be safe. But as a pedestrian, don't exercise that right of way. I don't, you should not exercise that right, okay? There's even some companies that have gone to say that the forklift has the operator, so they put the onus on the pedestrians to stay clear, which I see both ways as potential problems. But anyway, you have the right of way as a pedestrian, don't take the right of way, okay? Let that forklift go. That's like, I don't care if you have the right of way and you're completely in the right, driving down the interstate in your little Volkswagen, and that semi is out of, they may not have the right of way, but guess what? I'm giving it to them. They're a lot bigger than me, and I'm going to let them go through. And I won't comment on your driving, Steve.
I'm a good driver.
Debatable, matter of opinion, relative. There's all kinds of terms that can go behind that. Just kidding. You got me home and alive. So don't exercise your right of way. Horseplay, it goes without saying, I think, but I guess it doesn't because we always talk about it a lot. But horseplay is a major cause of problems, and it's no different on forklifts. Anybody ever want to Google something, just Google funny forklift accidents, and you'll see like hidden cameras in factories of people playing hockey with fork trucks and on the horse, polo and things like that. So it's crazy. People do stupid things. They don't realize how dangerous what they're doing is. Don't play on or near forklifts. Doesn't mean you have to be doing the horseplay with the forklift, but if you're doing horseplay around the forklift, you could be putting yourself in danger. Forklifts are not designed to have more than one operator on them. If they are designed to have more than one operator on them, they will have more than one seat belt. You don't have any that has more than one seat belt. So that means you don't take a ride on the forks, you don't take a ride standing on the side, and you don't sit on the wheel well as you're going, okay? It's one operator, nobody else gets on. And also understand that if we're wanting to fool around with the operator, we don't want to distract them. They've got a dangerous job. And if we're fooling around with them and they're paying attention to us jacking around, then they're not paying attention to what they really need to be paying attention to. So horseplay is a bad thing. Loading docks, the only thing I really want to point out about the loading docks, and it doesn't have to be a loading dock, okay? It can be, just loading areas, shipping areas. They're high traffic areas. They're places where there's a lot of activity and a lot of fork truck activity. So those are the areas that, we need to be extra cautious. We talked about preparing a load already, making sure the pallet's in good condition and everything's balanced and secure. Elevated platforms. Nobody here would ever have a pallet put on a fork truck and be raised up by it, right? I love asking that question because I always see the smirks, and so I know every one of you that's done it. Okay? Obviously, that's not a good idea. They used to do it all the time, and it was always unsafe. It's always caused a lot of accidents. But back when they did it all the time and it was routine, there wasn't scissor lifts around every corner. You've got scissor lifts that are very safe and that should be used in place of doing something like this. So don't allow yourself to take a shortcut and say, well, hey, just raise me up there. And if you see somebody else in the shop doing that, then we need to make sure that we get them down. Very unsafe. I had a very serious accident that I helped investigate where somebody, it was a plastic injection molding plant, and they had something clog up on top of one of the feeders for the plastic pellets. And so they went up on the forks and as they were up there about 30 feet in the air doing their thing, the pallet slid off the forks, and that person tumbled into the box of pellets, which in turn flipped off of the stand it was on, and they went tumbling 30 feet and laying with broken bones inside of a box of plastic pellets. So it happens. I mean, you get busy doing what you're doing, and you forget that that's not secure, and the pallet will teeter a little bit, and then you lose your balance. It's a very, very bad idea. As best we can, and it's not always possible, but as best we can, it's always best if we can have aisleways for pedestrians and aisleways for forklifts, but it's a very difficult task to make that happen because of the need for having things in certain places. Just a quick summary. Don't forget that working around a fork truck is very different than being around vehicles. Okay? When it comes to steering, what's the significant difference between a car and a forklift that cause a hazard to a pedestrian?
Rear wheels.
The rear wheel, which causes what? That rear end swing that you gotta watch out for. Drivers have reduced visibility and hearing. Don't forget about that. You know, don't just be lollygagging out there and forgetting about the fact that that forklift operator is having trouble seeing you because of all the blind spots that they have. Listen for all the warning signs, horns, backup alarms, engine noises, and look out for the warning lights. Stay away from forklifts unless the driver, you know, there's been some communication where you know they're stopped, and there's some communication where you know they saw you, and that then you can approach and keep your feet out from underneath. And wait till you're given the right of way. Don't exercise that pedestrian has the right of way thing. Okay? Are there any questions about working around forklifts? I know it's pretty simple stuff, but actually, as simple as it is, a lot of times we all forget, and I think it's a good reminder that you are working around something very dangerous when you go out on that shop floor or you go out to one of the job sites. Yes?
There was a company here in Evansville that used to use a forklift to connect pipes. And they did it a lot, and it worked. And what they did is they got on the fork truck and they put the pipe on it, and then they just really put the speed up on the fork truck and connected the pipe into the other pipe. And they did it a lot, and it worked. But one day they did it, and the pipe slipped, and it went through the driver. And it was one of the worst accidents, you know, the city has seen with the fork truck.
That sounds horrible. So it's basically they were jousting and somebody lost. You know, it's always happens that way too. I mean, every significant accident is always somebody's going to say, man, they've done it a million times. You know, they've been doing this for 30 years. They've been doing this for 5 years. They've been doing it for 10 years. Nobody's ever gotten hurt with it. And then it's that millionth and one time that somebody gets a pipe rammed through them, or you know, something similar to that. Well, thanks for sharing. I bet the people at that company started scrambling to find a new, better way to connect pipes. Anybody else have any comments or questions?
I just add that, you know, from the shop floor to the job site to Lowe's, be a defensive walker. Pay attention.
I agree. Constantly aware. Be aware of our surroundings. Anything else?
There's a weather watch till 5 o'clock for tornadoes, so kind of keep that in the back of your head, and we'll monitor it.
Is that 5?
Yeah, that was the last I seen. I'll check it when I get back to my desk.
Okay. Well, do you guys, I can do it either way. I know most of you have answered the questions. Do you want me to go through the answers, or feel pretty good about them? Okay, we won't go through them then. Just leave them on the corner of the table over there, and thank you all, and I'll see you next week.